share a little bit with you about some of my thinking around the intersections, as well as why these differences have historically existed in higher education. So I want to start out today by talking a little bit about what I consider a bifurcated approach. These two things have been historically approached separately in higher education, but also talk about what are the overlaps, what are the similarities between these two, and why this more bifurcated binary approach is no longer adequate, and how intercultural learning can potentially serve as a bridge. And then hopefully at the end of the day, we'll have some time for Q&A. So as I said, historically, these two things have been kept pretty separate in higher education. We have DEI work, multicultural education, everything around domestic diversity, and then global or international education. And I put intercultural here in parentheses because this is kind of a newer area that we're talking about in higher education, and it's been lumped so far usually with global education. They're kind of put together, and when we talk about our intercultural goals, we automatically go to what we're doing in global or international education as the go-to for achieving those intercultural goals. So let's talk very briefly about some of the history surrounding DEI work in higher education. So obviously this work is not just tied to the civil rights, but the civil rights movement is really what brought DEI work to the forefront in higher education in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s, with Brown versus Board of Education, challenges to Jim Crow laws. There were sit-ins, protests, and the focus at that time was really on access to higher education and more representation in higher education. Then more social groups, women's rights groups, gay rights, disability rights groups started pushing for more access and representation as well. As a result, many higher education institutions established support centers, student support centers, multicultural student services, and in the curricular realm, area studies. So that's when we saw women's studies and similar kind of majors and departments crop up in higher education. Over time, we started to realize, oh, just access and just bringing diversity into our schools is not enough. We actually have to address some of these inequities. And that's when focus shifted more on the achievement gap and really how do we help students from different backgrounds succeed in higher education. But it was still very much a deficit approach. Like, how do we help students succeed on our campuses? Eventually, there was more recognition from schools that the schools themselves were not necessarily prepared to educate students from diverse backgrounds for success, and schools had to really think about how to approach that differently. And over time, we've come to shift focus more and think more about social justice, equal opportunity, and explore how to eliminate inequalities. At the same time, diversity work, diversity training in higher education and different areas has sort of shifted over time. So Mary Frances Winters and the Winters groups have talked about 4 different phases or stages in diversity training. The first one, Diversity 1.0, was in the 1960s and 1970s. It was very litigious. It was very much about staying with the law. So we needed to stay out of trouble, and training was focused more on compliance. The 1980s and 1990s saw more of a shift to awareness training, sensitivity training. Now that we have people from different backgrounds together, how do we help everyone get along? So both of these phases were, in a sense, kind of focused on the moral aspect of diversity training, just doing the right thing. In the 2000s, we've seen more shift in focus to kind of a business case for diversity work in higher education. Diversity can help us compete. In order to attract the best and the brightest, we really need to focus on this area. And so in addition to thinking about the moral aspect of diversity, having diversity and diversity training, we started to think more about the business aspect. And looking into the future, when it comes to diversity in our institutions, it will be helpful to really start thinking more about sustainability. How does our diversity contribute to sustaining our world, sustaining our planet? We need diverse perspectives. We need diverse problem solving in order to sustain our planet and our world. Similarly, global education has kind of gone through some shifts and changes over the years. So as far as international exchange goes, originally the focus was on contact. We put people in contact with other cultures. And the assumption is that contact leads to all these wonderful things, reduce prejudice, increase diplomacy, more peace, etc. But over time, we started to realize, oh, we're putting people in contact, and that's not always happening. In fact, some people are really struggling in these situations. Peace Corps, for example, international exchange students, expatriates, people were struggling. And so we started to provide some training. Sometimes it was called intercultural training. Sometimes it was called other things, but that training really focused on knowledge, teaching people about the cultures that they were going to, do's and don'ts, teaching them about culture shock and those kinds of things. And the assumption was, we have this knowledge, we have these experiences, that knowledge helps people navigate these experiences, and we get those wonderful outcomes that we're assuming will happen. But, and this goes back to kind of my time here at the University of Minnesota, being in the right place at the right time, we started to do research and really understand in a deeper way that those two things coming together didn't necessarily lead to the outcomes that we were hoping for either. And so we realized we need to more actively facilitate intercultural learning. If we want the outcomes that we're expecting from these immersion experiences, from contact, we really have to actively facilitate it. And there's a growing realization, oh, this can happen in other environments besides just abroad. In any type of environment where we're navigating differences, we could potentially facilitate this kind of learning. So historically, they've kind of been separate in higher education because they've evolved a bit differently, but also there are some ongoing tensions, misunderstandings between these two different fields. So from a perspective of folks who have kind of grown up in the DEI sector and work in that area, one of the big critiques of intercultural learning is that it is tied to global education. It is assumed that these two things are the same thing, and global education tends to be seen as more privileged and elitist. Certain people have more access to global education opportunities. Historically, we know that white females make up the largest percentage of students who go abroad, for example. And so that leads to an assumption that intercultural learning is just about national cultures, learning about other countries, that it's really focused on learning about cultures, and that it doesn't really address things like power and privilege. And so there's an assumption that diversity 2.0 phase, it's just focused on, can't we all get along with one another? And this is kind of captured in this quote from a DEI practitioner who said, intercultural practice focuses on an overly simplistic, can't we all just get along approach, and does not fully address the construction of equity. So we have to think about, that might be the lens of folks coming from to intercultural learning from the DEI space. Now, critiques about DEI work traditionally, especially thinking about it from an international education perspective, have been that it can lack a global perspective. may wrongfully project domestic concerns into international contexts, and it's important to consider DEI-related issues in a broader global context. We know power, privilege, colonialism, all of these issues exist around the world, but the context is very different. So if we have students with their social justice training from the United States going abroad and just saying, well, that's racist, that's homophobic. Well, it might feel that way to you, but do you know whether that feels that way to people here? Are people feeling that way? Do they feel offended or not? So students really need to understand the context that they're in before they take their own social justice training, ideas, etc. abroad. Similarly, say you have a Japanese American student in the United States and they hear a question like, where are you from? That might come across as a microaggression. But to a Japanese student in the United States who hears, where are you from? That's an opportunity to connect. And so we have to think about the fact that someone's context, where they're coming from, is going to impact how they think about social justice, how we need to be talking about these issues with them. Another critique sometimes of the DEI space and approach training can be that it might put people on the defensive. Sometimes DEI training has one of two challenges. Either you're preaching to the choir, you have a room full of people who are nodding and who think, yeah, exactly. Or you have people who are on the defensive, who feel like, why are we doing training on white privilege? You're just attacking me and who I am. And that has to do with the fact that many of those trainings are not developmentally appropriate. They're not thinking about where people are in their own development and what they need to continue to develop. Some other differences and tensions between these areas, particularly within higher education, structural and administrative tensions, especially if you have one office that is in student services and another office, for example, that is in academic services. We all know that can, create some power dynamics within higher education. There's also competition for resources, money, of course, but also students. If an institution is recruiting more full tuition paying international students, they might be focusing on less on recruiting for domestic diversity. Space in curriculum. We may have, for example, Gen Ed DEI requirement. Well, how is that conceptualized? What kind of diversity, what kind of courses count and what doesn't count? So all of these things can create tensions between the offices and the folks who are working in these different areas. And then generally there can just be a lack of understanding. As I mentioned before, we may be interpreting DEI one way, whereas it's being operationalized on our campus another way. Folks in the DEI space may be thinking about intercultural learning in a way that is much more antiquated than how it is being approached. And finally, there are differing motivations and objectives, both of students who are utilizing these different services, as well as folks who are working in these areas. So if you work in international education, maybe it's because you had a wonderful international education experience and you want to bring that to your students. You might work in a multicultural student services office because you didn't have a great experience in college and you don't want that to happen for anyone else. Students who are coming to international education offices might be doing so for very different reasons than your students who are going to a multicultural student services office, an LGBTQ office, etc. And I think this is summarized really well in this quote from Jeremy Geller, who said, "A source of tension between multicultural and international education can arise from the different structural reporting lines used and the potential inequity in resource allocation between them. Additionally, international education is perceived by some stakeholders as glamorous, fun, and an asset to an institution, while multicultural education is hard work that addresses difficult past wrongs and serves as a deficit or cost to an institution. And so we've got these tensions, we've got these separate approaches, and yet, as you probably talked about in your conversations, there are really important overlaps as well. Some of the overlaps that you might not think about too much is that both multicultural education work, international education, are focused on experiential and transformational learning. We want to help students learn and grow through their experiences. Both are interdisciplinary and promote critical thinking and self-awareness. And both have historically operated on the peripheries of institutions. And then above all, there are many shared learning objectives. And Carlos Cortez, I think, highlights this really well when he said, both fields seek to help students comprehend the significance of human diversity, while at the same time addressing underlying commonalities, be they global or national. Both seek to increase awareness of how various phenomena, forces, trends, or institutions defined globally or nationally have differentially affected diverse groupings of people. Both seek to improve interpersonal and intergroup understanding and communications while reducing bigotry and stereotyping. So we have these overlaps, we have these tensions, but this separate approach doesn't really work for today's world, in my opinion. We talk about the VUCA world sometimes, the complex, volatile, ambiguous, and uncertain world that we're living in. And our diversity is growing increasingly diverse. Local and global are interconnected or inseparable. I mean, if you have, as Kathy said earlier, I think, a Black male student from Kenya, well, is he served more by the office that's talking about race and racism, or the office that's talking about his immigration service and helping him adapt to life in the United States? Yes, both and. He needs both of those services and support. And we all have intersectional identities. This is becoming more frequently talked about. But all of us have intersectional identities if you think about culture. Culture is not just nationality or ethnicity, it's all of the groups that we are a part of that we're socially conditioned by. So the groups that help form our norms, our values, our beliefs, our ways of experiencing the world, those are part of our culture. And none of us is part of just one group. And so we are all intersectional. And some of those identities might be more related to domestic diversity, and some may be more related to international diversity. And all of this diversity presents an opportunity to develop more complex mindsets, heart sets, and skill sets that are necessary to engage in this more complex future. And so all of our students now need to learn to navigate these differences. It's not just about serving students who want to go abroad, serving students who feel that they need additional support on campus, but it's really about producing more graduates who can engage more effectively and appropriately across all kinds of difference in our world today. Daryl Smith says, higher education must play a critical role if we are to achieve the promise of our democracy, developing a pluralistic society that works. Although few of us have lived or worked in such a setting, this is one of the foremost challenges of our day. So we have to think about preparing students for a world that we haven't had to think about preparing them for necessarily in the past. And this is where I want to suggest that intercultural learning can help us serve these goals and support both global education as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So I think of intercultural learning or intercultural development as a bridge, but also the intersection between these two. First of all, I think we have to start by disassociating the words international and intercultural. They're not the same thing. International refers to multiple nations and their institutions, whereas intercultural involves interaction or communication where differences in cultures play a role in the creation of meaning. We are making meaning, we are seeing the world, experiencing the world differently because of the cultural groups that we're a part of. And those differences may or may not involve national cultural differences. So it's important, I think, to define culture then, and there's a bazillion definitions of culture. It really depends on the context. But when we think about intercultural learning, intercultural development, we can define culture as a learned set of shared interpretations about beliefs, values, norms, and social practices that affect the behaviors of a relatively large group of people. And as I said before, that's not just nationality, it's not just ethnicity. It could be gender, regionality, socioeconomic status, physical ability, religion, et cetera, et cetera. We are all socialized in different ways depending on the groups that we're a part of. And so intercultural competence is really the ability to communicate and act appropriately, effectively, and authentically across cultural differences. Effectively meaning we achieve what we're trying to achieve. There's something we're trying to do. It's an intercultural situation with diverse perspectives. And so we need to do so in a way that's appropriate, that takes into account others who are involved, is respectful, and they all feel a sense of belonging. And we do it in a way that feels authentic. We're not compromising who we are in order to be interculturally competent. I also use terms a lot like intercultural learning, intercultural development. These are really just the process of developing one's intercultural competence because it's not a static thing. I think the word competence sometimes gets interpreted to mean there's this thing that we have or we don't have, when really it's an ongoing process of learning and development. And I want to talk a little bit about how intercultural learning and our thoughts around intercultural learning have shifted over time as well. So there's kind of three different eras of looking at and thinking about intercultural training. The first was positivism, when culture was really seen as something that could be observed, studied, classified, and descriptive information about cultures was sufficient. Then there was a more relativist period where we thought about culture as many different views of reality. We all have different experiences, different views, and cultures could only be understood in terms of their own culture, their own perspective. So this is where you see a lot of talk of it's not good or bad, it's just different. But that doesn't really help us learn how to navigate those differences. Just saying, oh, well, we can't judge that difference. That doesn't really help us become more interculturally competent. And so more recently, the intercultural learning approach is more constructivist and developmental, I would say. So the constructivist approach thinks of culture as a construction. Our experience is filtered through our lenses. So it doesn't seek to reify culture in any way, but really sees culture as an ongoing co-created process between ourselves and others. And so I think this is the space that really offers an opportunity moving forward. This is a major contribution is the developmental and constructivist approach, which is all about understanding how we make meaning of and experience the world. How do I see and experience the world based on my experiences as a white US American female, for example? And then how do I engage effectively and appropriately with other individuals who have very different experiences and ways of making meaning? So it's about developing a more complex mindset around cultural difference and cultural similarity. And there's many developmental models. Some of you may be familiar with other adult development theories, but they are all about developing a more complex mindset, moving from more binary thinking about things, us, them, good and bad, to more complex, more nuanced experiences. And this is what the developmental and constructivist approach to intercultural learning brings us, is an opportunity to help people develop more complex mindsets. And it also from an educator standpoint, can help us think about meeting learners where they are, whether those learners are students or colleagues that we're training, not creating trainings that are going to put people on the defensive, but trainings that will really meet people where they are and help them develop. And to deliver on many of our social justice and equity goals, it's really important to understand this developmental process, because if we're trying to hammer home ideas to people that they are not developmentally ready for, we're never going to achieve those goals. And so some of you may be familiar with the intercultural development continuum. I'm not going to go into depth about this, but this is a developmental model for thinking about how we experience cultural difference and similarity from more monocultural mindsets or more binary ways of seeing things, in denial and polarization. In denial, people simply miss culture. Things aren't cultural, they're just personal. And then we move into polarization, where people tend to see things in black and white, good and bad. In minimization, which is considered a more transitionary phase, people focus more on commonalities and similarities. Sure, you might be different, but deep down, we're all important we're all alike in more important ways. And so that focus on commonality and similarity can sometimes overshadow more important, deep differences. And as people move towards acceptance and adaptation, then they're able to really deeply understand differences, shift perspectives, see things from another person's point of view, and eventually adapt their behavior. That is where we're going to have the most success with social justice and a lot of DEI initiatives, is once people are ready to shift perspectives, to see things from a different point of view, to talk across difference. Whereas if they're not experiencing difference yet, or they experience difference, but in a very polarizing way, training, it needs to be different, needs to be developmentally appropriate. Another thing I want to highlight that this kind of brings up is that there are different and complementary roles when it comes to diversity training of all types. There's the advocacy role and the developer role. Someone who's playing the advocate, and we could take on both of these roles, but we need to think of them a little bit differently. When we're an advocate, we're trying to surface problems. We're being a little bit disruptive, arguing for expanding space at the table. And if we do cave, if we do, meet people where they are, that could be seen as caving. That could be seen as being a sellout. Whereas if we're in the developer role, we're really focused on problem solving and being strategic about driving change by adapting our behavior, by adapting the ways that we go about things and doing things in a way that meets people where they are developmentally. So both of these roles are needed, they're necessary, but they're very different and they're complementary. And if we're thinking about working with students and producing, globally competent, inclusive students, we need to meet them where they are and help them develop those skills, not just advocate for change. So I want to introduce you, before we wrap up, to a framework that I use for intercultural learning that I think really bridges the gap between these two different areas. So this comes originally from the work of Mick Vandenberg, who is a wonderful mentor and friend of mine. Originally, he conceptualized these as 4 different core competencies, but we've been working on this since then and are working on a book now and have shifted to think about these not so much as competencies, but as phases. So these are different phases that we need to focus on when we develop intercultural competence, whether it's our own intercultural competence or others. So the first phase is we need to increase understanding and awareness of our own characteristic ways of making meaning and acting in familiar and unfamiliar contexts. How am I judging this situation right now? Why am I judging it that way? Why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? Why am I having these reactions to this situation? So that self-awareness around our own ways of making meaning and experiencing things. And then other awareness. So increasing our understanding and awareness of how others might be making meaning and acting in familiar and unfamiliar contexts in ways that differ from our own. And then third, we need to be able to respond more mindfully in contexts that disorient or challenge us. So it's not just about that awareness, but then using that awareness to slow down instead of automatically reacting on autopilot, which we do with our own cultural lenses, oftentimes without realizing, but say, how do I want to act in a more intentional way in this situation, understanding that I may be making meaning of this situation very differently from others involved. And finally, then the ultimate goal is to bridge the cultural gaps in those contexts to shift our perspective, attune our emotion, and adapt our behavior in ways that are going to be effective and appropriate to that context. And all of this requires ongoing practice. This is not something like you go through, okay, I got 1, I got 2, I got 3, I'm done now. I'm interculturally competent. I can go out into the world and do no good, no harm. But you have to be practicing all of these things regularly. And these things kind of are interrelated. And if we think about these particularly from an educator standpoint, I like to think about starting at the center here and moving out. So if you think about phases 1 and 2 of understanding how you make meaning of the world, how you experience things, and then how others may make meaning of the world and experience things, these are kind of back and forth. Some of you may be familiar with the analogy of the fish out of water. It's once that fish gets out of water, it realizes it was swimming in water and what water was. It's once we interact with people from different cultures that we go, oh, I didn't know that that was like my norm and my way of doing things. I guess I just assumed everybody did it that way. And as we learn about ourselves and the ways we make meaning of the world, we can better appreciate that, oh, somebody with a very different experience, very different upbringing might be making meaning of this and seeing this in a very different way. So those are kind of foundational. And then from there, we can move out to engaging in more mindful ways. Now that I have this awareness, how do I want to respond in an intentional way as opposed to just react? And ultimately, we can move out to be more capable of bridging those differences. And so this is how I like to think about and approach intercultural learning. I work with educators now to help them develop their intercultural competence and integrate intercultural learning into what they do, whether it's international education or pharmacology courses, graphic design courses, career services. And this framework, I think, resonates with a lot of people because no matter what their context, whether they're dealing with domestic diversity, international diversity, they see the connections and see ways to help students learn and develop and grow in all of these areas and see how that serves them at home as well as abroad.